Bourbon, my favorite topic. I get it. You may be wondering how it ties in. Back in Washington's first administration, Alexander Hamilton, the guy they did the musical about, was the Secretary of the Treasury. One of his big fundamental things was he felt like the federal government should be really, really strong. And to make the federal government strong, he had some financial initiatives he wanted to push through. And I promise we're going to get to the market revolution in a second. But he wanted to make the federal government strong financially, as well as its authority over the states. To do that, he felt like a couple of things needed to happen. One, a national bank. Two, the federal government needed to take all the wartime debt from the revolution off the states and subsume that debt themselves and pay it off, which would prevent states from defaulting on loans, which would keep the nation's credit stronger. That makes some sense on the surface, okay? But how do you do that? And one of Hamilton's ideas was to create this really expansive excise tax. And it was brand new to the nation. And frankly, he got the idea from Great Britain. And which sounds really odd considering that we just fought a war to get away from Great Britain. But he did. That's where he got a lot of his ideas from. And Great Britain had been doing an excise tax for a number of years. Part of the excise tax was spirits. And there's a whole rabbit trail we can run down about how whiskey in 1791 is not what you would think of today. And frankly, thank God for that, because whiskey in 1791 did its job, but it was rough getting there, okay? But the way the excise tax was set up, and this is where we get to the market revolution, it favored big business. And big business was really starting to grow, especially in the northeastern part. You had the Jeffersonians in the early Republican Party that felt like the nation's economy should be agrarian and cottage industry based. And trust me, nothing was more cottage industry at the time than the production of whiskey. But Hamilton and his cronies felt like a manufacturing base with all the natural resources available to the colonies would be a better way to go for a national economy. So when Hamilton started putting these excise taxes, they really favored big business. And the simple version of the market revolution is businesses started to grow. People moved in from the countryside to take those jobs in the city. That happened. Part of that, and we'll talk for a second about it, the Whiskey Rebellion, which happened in the early 1790s, after this excise tax came out. Because the excise tax was written in a way where it taxed possible production. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion basically took place in western Pennsylvania, what's now West Virginia, western part of Virginia, in a very agrarian-based economy. Corn grew really well there. Most people were subsistence farmers in that area, and frankly in the South and a big chunk of the nation at the time. If they had anything left over, they would sell it if they could, or they might trade it and barter it. Now here's where whiskey becomes important to the market revolution. All of these small independent family farms that grew grain had leftover grain, if it was a good year. Grain didn't stay good very long in storage at the time, so they would convert it to alcohol, bad whiskey, really bad moonshine. That would become what they bartered with. And the economy of the nation was in such bad shape in the early part of the American experiment that whiskey was actually a more stable form of currency than the paper money being issued by either the states or the federal government with that federal bank that we just talked about. So the people out west preferred to barter whiskey with their leftover grain that they made, or they made it from. People in the bigger cities had access to banking, had access to loans. They were buying up the bonds that Hamilton was creating. For them, paper money was fine and stable. So the excise tax, particularly on whiskey, was geared towards big producers because the way it was written, it set up a tax on your ability to produce, not on what you actually produced. So in the big cities, a big distiller could keep going all year long. Out in the West, people only produced grain whiskey when they needed to. So they might have a still capable of 500 gallons a year and only produce 50 or 60. But they were going to be taxed on the 500. That's when we get to the market revolution. A lot of the nation's early economic policies, as set up by Hamilton, and frankly Washington went along with it because he believed in a strong federal government as well. Hamilton had been his chief of staff throughout the bulk of the revolution. He trusted the guy. So Washington went along with it. This caused a lot of problems in the West. There was actually a rebellion of sorts. Tax collectors were tarred, feathered, scalped, houses burned. The militia actually organized well enough to stand up and fight in such a strong manner that Washington led 13,000 troops into western Pennsylvania to put this rebellion down. That's more troops than Washington had when Cornwallis refused to surrender at Yorktown and made his second in command surrender, right? So it was a pretty big deal. Washington really didn't want to go that far. This is the wedge that came between Washington and Jefferson as founding fathers. Because by this time, Jefferson had already stepped down from being Secretary of State. He was out at Monticello, probably planning his run at the presidency at that moment. But Hamilton and Jefferson, who had never gotten along anyway, really didn't see eye to eye on this one. And Jefferson blasted it pretty hard. Good news is, nobody fired a shot. Washington showed up. A lot of the people that were leading the rebellion had actually served Washington. They were able to negotiate out of it. About 150 people were actually arrested. Only 2 were convicted. Imagine that, not getting convicted in a local court doing what your neighbors wanted. The 2 that were convicted were sentenced to death. Washington pardoned both of them. It's the first instance of a presidential pardon. So kind of a lot of cool trivia in there. But the main takeaway is a big push of the market revolution, economics. And the economics behind it came from a lot of the excise taxes Hamilton created in hopes of creating a strong federal government. The good news for the people of Western Pennsylvania, and frankly anybody that owned a still and was making their own booze at the time, was, we had Washington, his 2 terms were up, Adams, 2 terms were up, but then we got to Jefferson. Jefferson got rid of the excise tax on whiskey and frankly a lot of excise taxes. So it all kind of worked out in the end, but it laid the foundation for the way the economy of the nation would function. And it was a big pivot point in showing that the federal government supported big business over small individuals. That might sound familiar to you, but I'm not going to get into that conversation. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on why bourbon, the nation's official spirit, is so important to the founding of the country and a lot of the policies you still see today. All right. Have a great night and hope you enjoyed it.